knows that I have a soft spot for snowy mountains. As the ship I was travelling on approached our next destination, the early morning sun caught the snowy mountains of the vast Botdalen Nature Reserve rising above the small village of Talvik and the Melsvik Inlet. Welcome to Alta. Oh, the joy of a snowy mountain scene. Watercolour is 70% inspiration and 30% graft. There has to be something that grabs our attention and inspires us to want to put paint to paper in the first place. Well, if that doesn't happen, then we're faced with the challenge of hunting around for something to actually paint. I find the process of drawing out mountains to be totally immersive. They make their impact when we first look at them, but forcing oneself to paint or draw a scene means looking at it a little bit closer and exploring the topography. I think that's probably the point at which I'm truly hooked. Once I'm satisfied with my drawing, it's time to start throwing some paint at it. The logical place to start is with the sky, since this will help to establish the general mood of the scene. Because the sky was clear as we were approaching Alta, I'd chosen Prussian blue for the job. But I also want to inject a hint of warmth into the scene. For this, I'm applying a small amount of cadmium yellow to the sky. This will be followed by a small amount of cadmium red. The two will hopefully create a hint of golden light. But more importantly, the red will act as a transitional barrier between the blue and the yellow to prevent the sky from going green. That's the plan, anyway. In practice, I think it was a little bit touch and go there. Needed a bit of extra working in, very borderline. I'm also using the Prussian blue to paint in the water in the foreground. Using the same blue will help to create a visual link between the two areas. It also helps to make the sea look quite calm. There's just one little thing I need to do to prevent it from looking too flat. I'm mixing up some French ultramarine to add to the foreground and darken it slightly. In general, having a dark foreground leading into the light is a compositional trick that just works, drawing the eye into the scene. To help maintain a sense of harmony, I've chosen to keep with the Prussian blue, at least for now, as I start to pick out the contours of the hills. This is where things start to get really interesting. Without any shadows, snow looks flat and two-dimensional. As soon as you start applying them, however, the contours start to come to life. It's vitally important, of course, that the shadows not only follow the contours but actually help to visually explain them. They should curve accordingly and not be too straight, since straight implies flat. Care needs to be taken to ensure that the brush marks don't send out the wrong message. One of the things that particularly attracted me to the scene was the incredible warmth visible in the hillside. Trees and crags all taking on the same golden brown colour in the morning light. For this I've mixed up burnt umber, cadmium yellow and cadmium red. As with the blue shadows, it's important to make sure that the marks follow the lie of the land and don't contradict it in any way. Anything too geometric or angular would look out of place and unnatural, but I also have to take care not to create any patterns that are too repetitive. Don't get me started on faces. It's perilously easy when laying down random brush marks to end up with patterns that take on human characteristics. Of course, if you stare at a mountain or at clouds or anything natural for that matter long enough, then you'll start to see faces in it. It has a technical term, pareidolia. The way to avoid it is to stop and stand back from your painting as often as possible, to try and keep seeing it with a fresh eye. Hopefully to prevent faces from happening before they occur. The problem is, once you've created them, they can be extremely difficult to remove. They just keep coming back to haunt you no matter what you do. The blue shadows are looking fine, but with the addition of the warm tones to the scene, moving things along, they're now starting to look a little too pale. I need something with a bit more intensity. For this, I've mixed up my two favourite colours, or at least the two colours that I find myself using the most, French ultramarine and burnt umber. If you start with ultramarine and add burnt umber to it, small amounts at a time, you'll find the two colours neutralise each other. If you get the balance exactly right, you'll end up with a neutral grey. By adding extra French ultramarine to it, however, I'm able to create more of a blue-grey, perfect for the slightly darker areas of shadow. What I'm doing is taking hints from the earlier Prussian blue shadows and generally keeping my new darker shadows within those shapes. One of the knock-on effects of this is to increase the relative brightness of the white snow alongside it. In watercolour, tone is relative. So the lighter and brighter you want something to appear, the darker the neighbouring tone needs to be. It's all about tweaking the contrasts where they're needed the most. So here, for example, I love working in the details on the darker hillside. But look at how much more impact the brighter, closer slope now has. There's a real sense of the brighter slope being pulled forward and the darker one being pushed back. Every brush mark counts. The smaller details on the steep, dark slope just add to its precipitousness. And yes, there is such a word. I just checked it. The gentler slopes are just as important though, providing topographical contrast. I'm guessing they'll be skiers' slopes. Whichever way you look at it, the important elements here are the playoff between light and dark tones that ultimately help to explain the three-dimensional properties of the mountains. Let's not forget the sea in the foreground. Even though things are quite calm, there would still be some movement in the water's surface. It isn't still water like a lake, this is the sea. So I'm adding a few gentle waves, using the same blue-grey mix that I used in the hillside. The rise and fall of the waves are deliberately gentle, with more of a curve to them than any sharp angles. And of course, waves obey the laws of perspective, so the waves that appear further away from us are smaller, thinner, and more closely packed together. I don't want to overdo these details. Too many will start to look overly busy, and the sense of calm tranquility will quickly be lost. One of the biggest errors I see students making with water is to overwork the details. Of course, water is constantly moving, which makes things difficult, but less is always more in these situations. In watercolour, we work from light to dark. I'm mixing up French ultramarine and burnt umber again, but this time with a little more intensity, and I'm adding a small amount of alizarin crimson to it to warm it up very slightly. At this point, all the most important groundwork has already been done. The mood of the piece was established early on, and the general three-dimensional shapes of the mountains are now easy to interpret and understand. What I need to do from now on is to build upon those foundations, adding darker tones to increase impact in certain areas, and to sculpt the mountains that little bit further, pulling some things out and pushing others back. In some places, I'll leave hard edges to maximise upon those contrasts. In other areas, I'll soften the marks off with a damp brush to mould curves and blend in the transitions between dark and light wherever appropriate. This is the point where the composition can be refined, giving extra prominence to elements that require it, or knocking back what I would consider to be secondary or less important elements. Essentially, it's all a bit of a balancing act,